In April of 2020, and to much fanfare, Square-Enix released the first part of the Final Fantasy VII Remake. More important to the subject matter of this video is what they did in that remake regarding the choices in the design process. As a quick note, there will be some spoilers for Final Fantasy VII in this video. Leading up to release, there was never any strong indication whatsoever that this was going to be anything other than a remake of Final Fantasy VII, but what we received was something else entirely, a sort of sequel or reimagining. While there are many theories presently regarding what exactly Remake is, I think it's truly safe to say that no one aside from the developers know the real answer with any precision until we get further along in the series. The series will consist of 3 parts, so with the launch of Rebirth later next month, it is possible we will have a much better idea of where Square plans to go with this game series. This is the primary focus of this video. I'm wondering, is Square about to drop a lot of bombs again, or are they moving back and taking it closer to the original source material with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth? As much as it's a common no-duh situation today to say that it was never going to be a one-to-one remake, I think that's not as easily said in the years leading up to release, and is an oversimplification of the argument. I don't believe people, including myself, were expecting a one-to-one remake, rather a remake of the original game with more modern technology. If you take a moment to review interviews with developers as well as promotional materials related to the game, including the demo released prior to the launch of the game, it's impossible to draw a conclusion that the game would so radically diverge from what Final Fantasy VII was. Don't get me wrong, I think most people would reasonably expect that some things would change by default due to the advances in technology and the simple fact that the core gameplay systems, such as the battle system, were changing. Further, there would be obvious additions in order to pad out Midgar to be a complete game, being that it was a very short portion of the original title. This much was evident by pre-release material and should be taken as a safe assumption. However, with all facts considered, I think Square pulled something like the Kojima swap that we experienced with Metal Gear Solid 2, in which there was never any indication that the player would, in fact, be taking control of Raiden and not series staple Solid Snake. Much like the changes to Final Fantasy VII, Raiden came as a complete surprise to everyone playing the game. While there were some allusions to surprises and others such that the player would discover, I don't think anyone expected a complete retcon or sequel or whatever this amalgamation is they've created. Leading up to the release of Final Fantasy VII Remake, I was about as hyped as I'd ever been for a game release. For years, fans have been indicating they wanted a remake of Final Fantasy VII due to a few primary reasons. I would argue that can boil down to 2 main reasons. One of which being the less than stellar translation the game received, and the other being the graphical fidelity of the game. While I can overlook the problems with translation and general script to still very much enjoy the original, I think that Final Fantasy VII most certainly did release during a very transitional period for the gaming industry, in addition to being on completely new hardware with a brand new delivery medium. Some of these factors likely led to the now famously blocky and low polygon character models that we ended up with in the original Final Fantasy VII. We know that better is possible because the years following FF7's release featured characters with much higher polygon counts across various games, and even Final Fantasy VIII clearly illustrates this. The pre-render backgrounds still look great even today, but the field models are what dates the game the most. This in mind, and with players seeing what remakes can do when titles like Resident Evil for GameCube hit the market, it's easy to understand why some fans may have salivated for a remake of the beloved title. It would be quite a long time before this became a reality, though there were hints along the way that this was on Square's mind. Going back to interviews, we can see the developers intentionally avoided speaking to these kinds of changes, as most of the talk of change appeared to be primarily focused on the obvious and admitted change, that to the core gameplay and the battle system, considering this was a ground-up remake. There are various interviews in which they do talk about changes, but in very vague terms. For example, in a 2016 interview with Game Informer, Yoshinori Kitase talks about how there are many who consider Final Fantasy VII sacred and that it shouldn't be touched, but they think that they, quote, know the balance between what can be changed versus what needs to be protected, unquote. Anyone who looks at this after playing the final portion of that game surely couldn't take such a statement straight. In the same interview, he speaks lightly in terms of potential new content as far as adding characters from the extended universe that have become all of the post-FF7 products. For example, stating that there may be characters or references to the content, but he states this as if it will be minor. Heading forward to 2020, we can look at yet another interview on Square's website with the very same developer. The question is asked, how difficult was it to balance old and new elements in Final Fantasy VII Remake? To which he replies, quote, you can't really make a clear distinction between what's new and what's from the original in Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's all blended together to make a self-contained story for the first game in the project, unquote. While not explicitly stated, To me, this reads as though the content blends well with the original content of the game, which is anything but the case. Much of the content that was added turns out to be bloat in order to pad out the playtime necessary to make a full game out of what is effectively a 3 to 5 hour portion of the real game. I do agree with his use of the word blended, however. They absolutely did throw FF7 into a blender. Later, in this same interview in 2020, Kitase speaks of Sephiroth and how he appears much earlier than he does in the original game. He states that, quote, "I was inspired by the movie Jaws, which took a similar approach of teasing this powerful presence, but never fully showing you the shark until later in the story. We wanted to build him up as this really big, powerful character in people's minds. By only referring to him indirectly, it created this feeling of fear and oppression. So when he makes his first appearance, it's a big deal. But for the remake, that doesn't work so well, partly because everyone knows who Sephiroth is. We didn't think it would be as effective to have him held back until later on in the story." I think there's irony in this statement. How could he come from an angle of such elegance in regard to the villain's presentation to perform effectively a 180? The Sephiroth we see in Remake is almost clownish or cartoonish in his incessant appearances that begin almost immediately. I understand this is a personal take, but I completely disagree that the same approach used in the original would not have been effective in the remake. I think it could have been even more effective because people knew who he was, not the other way around. I can't know that for sure, of course, that's just my opinion. Some will point to articles such as the one on Gematsu highlighting the job posting that Square made with the statement, quote, "Due to the huge reaction, we are aiming at nothing less than a new creation, not limited to a simple remake," unquote. I think this could be interpreted in many ways, but in no way is it a definitive statement implying drastic changes to the plot. This could easily be read as the creative difficulties when transforming media. It had been 20 years at this point. It makes perfect sense that a remake would indeed be a new creation, so to speak. Of course, the goal would be to surpass the original, but that doesn't inherently mean that it will be altered fundamentally, just that the goal to surpass in visuals, gameplay, presentation, and etc. I think this is a moot point and doesn't back up either argument, either for or against the changes to the game being obvious. In 2019, there was an article posted on Gematsu summarizing an interview with Tetsuya Nomura, and a few key takeaways can be observed. First is that the whispers are mentioned, but not much elaborated upon. More importantly, regards additions to the scenario. He states, quote, "While the main story itself hasn't changed, there are a countless number of new events," unquote. Again, I think one could take from this that, well, the main story hasn't changed. After playing the game, that's obviously not true. By the end of the first remake, things have changed a lot, and the implication for further changes is very strong. Even on the day of launch, Kitase released a video statement that includes the following, quote, "Fans may be thinking, I wonder what happened to that scene. But we revived the original game using the state-of-the-art technology and the best graphics, making it into a game that meets or goes beyond your expectations and is exciting to play." Now mind you, once the game released, Nomura stated that Remake had two meanings and that we would find out what he meant by that in the coming years. Obviously, interviews and statements made once the game released have very little to do with the conversation at hand. When the trailer finally came and we saw what appeared to be Cloud and Barrett walking through a busy street, presumably in Midgar, the excitement from fans was palpable, despite Square's offerings in the Final Fantasy universe seeming to reach lower levels of critical acclaim as the years went on. After all, this would be Final Fantasy VII. Wouldn't it? Well, no. Final Fantasy VII Remake is not Final Fantasy VII. Reimagining or sequel, whatever it may be, it's not Final Fantasy VII. That initial feeling of excitement, of reliving one of my favorite games of all time with modern graphics and one of the best combat systems Square's designed in years, deflated like a tire with a nail embedded within it, slowly but inevitably, and at ever-increasing speed as time marched forward as I played farther into the game. At first it wasn't entirely too noticeable. The changes were small and reasonable, if not necessarily agreeable, such as with Jesse and the bomb for Reactor Number 1, which I'll elaborate further upon in a bit. But as the game went on, the changes became too much to bear. What were these ghosts? Why was Sephiroth showing up so early and constantly being referenced long before he appears in the real game? Why is it necessary to add into the game completely unremarkable characters like Roche that do little to add to the experience or even detract? Speaking of, why are we altering the fate of secondary characters that most certainly died in the real game? Why are we having an epic boss battle with Sephiroth before even leaving the Midgar city limits? In the original game, the player didn't even know what Sephiroth looked like at this point, much less encounter him in a ridiculous manner such as this, flying through time and space with Cloud slicing buildings in half, despite being the beginning of the game, in relation to the full storyline. Why excessively pad out the area of Midgar instead of using those resources to get farther into the story? Elaborating upon existing zones like Wall Market makes some sense, but the nighttime visit to Sector 7's surface isn't enticing, to name at least one. Look, I don't hate all the changes Final Fantasy VII Remake made. As I mentioned earlier, I'm alright with elaborating upon existing areas or fleshing out certain things. I'll give an example. When the player visits Reactor 5, there is now this entire sequence of escaping that has you encounter various terminals relating to the Shinra weapon, Airbuster. At this point, the player has the option to choose various resources to remove from Airbuster's arsenal, and I'm quite alright with this. I never said or implied this needed to be a one-to-one remake of the original title. I do expect some changes. But some changes and fundamentally altering the plot, message, and feel of the game are completely different matters entirely. I know some will argue that this is the sequel and all of that jazz. That's great, but Square should have marketed it as such to begin with so people would not be so disappointed upon playing what they thought was a remake of one of their favorite games of all time that instead plays out like some ridiculous fan fiction. Regarding some of the more egregious changes, there are smaller ones, such as removing the blood from the Shinra Tower during one of the final sequences there, and there are those that I would consider middle of the line in terms of importance, like the situation with the bomb at Reactor 1. Jessie does make a comment regarding the bomb being a little bit bigger than she anticipated, but she also states that she looked up a schematic online. It's absolutely plausible that she overbuilt in this case, causing more damage than she had intended. Obviously, she's never crafted a bomb of this size. The point being is that this group absolutely did this. They intended to blow up the reactor. They blew up the area, and this is something the player and those characters have to think about moving forward, whereas in the remake, the bomb is effectively a dud, and Shinra blows up their own reactor, while the end result of blaming the terrorists, Avalanche, is still the same. The way the player perceives the actions is much different. Further, it doesn't have the same emotional weight when instead of being directly responsible for the deaths, the mega-corporate Big Bad is the one that's actually responsible. This removes all culpability from the cast and causes any lamenting about this to be hollow in execution. At best, this could be viewed as trying to distance the main cast from the terrorist label in the modern day versus 1997, but at worst it's a complete retcon that has a big impact on how the cast is perceived in terms of overall plot and their motivations or realizations that transpire later in the game. Other problems that may have impacts far beyond what we can see now would be decisions such as keeping characters like Biggs alive, which completely removes any emotional impact their death may have had. Why? What is the purpose of keeping them alive and fundamentally altering the story like this? I'm sure they have something in mind for this, and there's much more where that came from, I'm sure. The bigger and more problematic change transpires with Square's Whispers and the Kingdom Hearts-style boss and sequence the player ends up facing by the end of the game. It makes absolutely no sense, in the context of an actual FF7 remake that is, to have such a final sort of boss encounter with Sephiroth, even parroting some of the final moments from the original game that transpire in the Northern Crater, at the end of the highway in Midgar, much less all the absurd building chopping and celestial fate goings-on. But enough about the faults of Remake. Those have been well tread and discussed over time. Despite all of my complaining, what I'm exceedingly curious about now is what Square plans to do with Rebirth. Will Rebirth take the train completely off rails into a new dimension, or will Square fall back into the actual story of Final Fantasy VII? It's difficult to say at this point, as much of the pre-release material is relatively sterile in terms of what it reveals, sticking much like the first game to known points of interest in the earlier areas of each respective portion of the game. There are some outliers though, like seeming portrayals of Zack Fair and what that could mean for the title. While many seem to clamor for Zack to live on and appear in this title, that completely annihilates his story and the point of his character. While we're at it, why have any characters die ever, and why not have a picnic with everyone for the end credits? The story was great because there was gravity, and not the kind you get from equipping materia. After playing the first remake, I swore I would not be buying the subsequent games unless at a discount, because I was so absolutely disappointed in what they decided to do. I don't want to be lulled into another trap by somehow convincing myself that they will fall back and stick closer to the script this time. At the same time, aside from those disappointments with the direction the game has taken, I enjoyed the overall package of FF7 Remake far more than the offering given with Final Fantasy XVI last year. At the end of the day, this game had a false title, gave a false impression of how faithful they would be to the original, and is a literal sequel or reboot of some kind. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but I might just have to dive in for the gameplay alone, even if the plot makes me cringe and the alterations hurt my soul, knowing that we will never actually receive a real remake of Final Fantasy VII. So despite all of that bitching, I'll probably see you in February. Please remember to drop a like if you made it this far into the video, and if you enjoyed my rant, or didn't, feel free to comment below to your heart's content. As always, you're welcome to subscribe to the channel for further content like this and much more. Until next time, my friends.